24 men have seen the Earth from the moon. Not in photographs. Not on a screen. The actual Earth. And every single one of them came back different. Not different the way a vacation changes you. Not different the way a hard year changes you. One of them quit NASA and founded a research institute into human consciousness. One wept in front of his crew mid-mission and couldn't explain why. From something they couldn't name. And when scientists finally started asking these men what happened up there, the answer wasn't wonder. It wasn't pride. It wasn't the thrill of being in space. It was a complete collapse of the self. And that is where this gets interesting. Let's start with Edgar Mitchell. December 1971. NASA astronaut. Test pilot. MIT-educated engineer. The kind of man who did not believe in anything he could not measure. The sixth human being in history to walk on the surface of the moon. And on the ride home, 3 days out from Earth, he floated to a window and looked out at the universe. And something broke open inside him. He said it wasn't just seeing the stars. It was a sudden, instantaneous recognition that the molecules in his body, the molecules in the spacecraft, the molecules in every star he was looking at, had all been forged in the same ancient stellar explosion billions of years ago. He said he suddenly knew this. The way you know that fire is hot. He said, I knew that the universe was in some way conscious. I just knew it. Now understand who is saying this. Edgar Mitchell was not a poet. He was not a philosopher. He was a hard-edged aerospace engineer who had just walked on the moon. He was precisely the kind of person who did not say things like, the universe is conscious. And yet here he was, 3 days from Earth, completely undone by a view from a window. He kept it to himself the entire flight back. He sat with it for months after returning. And then he quit NASA. He moved to Florida. And he founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, an organization dedicated to rigorously studying the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. It still exists today. He spent the remaining 45 years of his life trying to scientifically explain what happened to him in that window. He never fully could. And here's the thing. He is not the only one. Ron Garan is a NASA astronaut who spent 178 days aboard the International Space Station in 2011. He was floating near a window on the ISS, looking down at the Earth slowly rotating below him. He saw the thin blue line of the atmosphere curving along the edge of the planet, and his brain, without asking his permission, registered what it was actually looking at. The entire atmosphere. Every molecule of breathable air on Earth. Every cloud, every weather system, every lungful of oxygen any creature on that planet would ever draw. The whole of it visible as a thin, fragile, luminous line. He said it looked like the skin of an apple. That skin. That impossibly thin skin. That is all that stands between every living thing and the vacuum of space. He described tears arriving before he even understood he was crying. Because from 250 miles up, Earth looked perfect. Impossibly beautiful. Whole. And at the same time, he knew what was happening on its surface. The poverty. The wars. The damage. The suffering. And none of the lines that divide it were visible from up there. No borders. No fences. No walls. Just one continuous, unbroken, breathing sphere. Wrapped in a skin as thin as an apple's. He came back and wrote a book. He started an organization called Fragile Oasis. He spent years after his return trying to put language around something he said human language was not built to hold. This experience is so consistent, so uniform across astronauts of different nationalities and backgrounds and personalities, that in 1987 a writer and space philosopher named Frank White decided to study it properly. He spent years interviewing 29 astronauts in detail. He asked them not about the technical experience of spaceflight. He asked them about the psychological experience. What they described almost universally was a shift in awareness so sudden and so complete that it felt less like an emotion and more like a system update. A new operating system installed without warning. White called it the overview effect. He defined it as a cognitive shift in awareness that results from seeing Earth from a distance. Not the weightlessness. Not the silence. Not the speed. Specifically the view. The experience of seeing Earth as a single object. Whole. Small. Unbroken. Suspended in an otherwise total darkness. That one image. That one perspective. And here's where it gets complicated. Because what these men are describing is not simply awe. We know what awe is. We've all felt it. The Grand Canyon. A thunderstorm. The first note of a live orchestra in a hall with good acoustics. Awe is a recognizable human experience. We have a word for it. We have a physiology for it. But awe fades. You drive home from the Grand Canyon, and you stop being in awe. You eat dinner. You go to sleep. You wake up, and you're yourself again. These men. They were never themselves again. Think about that for a second. A single view from a window. And it permanently rewired how they processed reality. So what is actually happening inside a brain that sees the Earth from space? In 2018, a research team at the University of Pennsylvania led by neuroscientist Andrew Newberg published findings from a study specifically examining the neurological signatures of the overview effect. Newberg has spent decades studying what happens inside the brain during states of self-transcendence. What he found in astronauts was something his lab had seen before. A disruption of the default mode network. Here's what that means. Your default mode network is the part of your brain that is active when you're thinking about yourself. It is the constant background hum of your identity. The mental machinery running when you're not focused on any external task. The part of your brain that continuously processes the concept of I, me, mine. It is the neurological architecture of the self. And when people have experiences of overwhelming self-transcendence, documented in meditators, in people given psilocybin in clinical settings, in people in the deepest states of prayer, the brain scans show the same pattern. The default mode network goes quiet. Not off. Quiet. The boundary between self and not self softens. The wall your brain normally maintains between me and everything outside of me becomes temporarily permeable. And the result, described across hundreds of different people in hundreds of different contexts, is always some version of the same thing. An overwhelming sense of unity. A dissolving of the edges of the self. A feeling that resists translation into language because language was built by and for the default mode network. It was built to describe a self interacting with a world it is separate from. When the separation disappears, the words stop working. What Edgar Mitchell described on the ride back from the moon. What Ron Garan described floating above Earth. What dozens of astronauts have come back trying to put into sentences that keep falling short. Newberg's research now has a neurological framework for all of it. Their default mode networks were disrupted. Not by a drug. Not by meditation. Not by years of spiritual practice. By a view from a window. But here is where it gets even stranger. Dr. Keltner is a psychologist at UC Berkeley who has spent more than 2 decades studying the specific emotion of awe. What it does to the brain. What it does to behavior. What makes it different from every other positive emotion. In 2003, he published a landmark paper in the journal Cognition and Emotion arguing that awe is one of the most cognitively disruptive experiences a human being can have. That it specifically targets the brain's tendency to sort incoming information into existing categories. When something is too large, too unexpected, too far outside the scope of what your existing mental models can accommodate, the brain cannot categorize it. It cannot file the experience away. And that failure to file, Keltner argues, is exactly where transformation happens. When your brain cannot fit an experience into an existing folder, it has to rebuild the filing system. It has to update the framework itself. And in that rebuilding, the person you were before the experience and the person you are after are genuinely, structurally different. Not metaphorically. Neurologically. Now, Keltner was studying this from photographs, from music, from natural landscapes. He was not studying astronauts. But in 2016, his lab published a study specifically on the overview effect. They interviewed and surveyed dozens of astronauts and found something that set their experience apart from any terrestrial awe he had ever documented. The scale. When you stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon, you feel small. But the Grand Canyon is still inside the world you belong to. It is still part of the same continuous surface you are standing on. When you see Earth from space, you are outside of it. Fully outside. You are looking at every person you have ever loved, every road you have ever driven, every country that has ever declared itself a country, from the outside. As an object. As a whole. From a vantage point that no creature in Earth's 4.5 billion year history had ever occupied before 1961. And the human brain, Keltner's team concluded, was never built for this perspective. For all 300,000 years of our existence as a species, every single human brain that ever ran was inside. Always inside. Locked in the gravity well. Locked on the surface. We could understand intellectually that we lived on a planet. We could draw pictures of it. We could write equations about it. But no human nervous system had ever actually left. Had ever stood outside the atmosphere and looked back. Until Yuri Gagarin. April 12, 1961. And what the overview effect research is now showing us is that when a human brain, built and evolved entirely inside, finally steps outside and looks back, something in its architecture does not know what to do. It doesn't have a folder for the entire world as a single object. And in the absence of a folder, everything gets reorganized. Here is something the mainstream coverage of the overview effect almost never mentions. The changes do not always feel good. Edgar Mitchell's story is the famous one. The peaceful transcendence. The cosmic unity. The life-rearranging clarity. But that is not what happened to everyone. Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, came back and fell into a depression so severe it nearly destroyed him. He has spoken about it publicly and written about it at length. He described returning from the moon and slipping back into ordinary life as a kind of unbearable diminishment. Like being asked to care about small things after you had seen something that made every human concern seem, for a moment, almost impossibly small. He struggled with alcoholism for years. He checked himself into rehab. He rebuilt his life. And he has been honest that part of what broke him was the contrast. The whiplash. Going from the moon to a press tour. From the scale of the cosmos to scheduling appearances and signing autographs. The world had not changed. He had. And the gap between those two things was almost more than he could carry. Frank White, in his original research, named this the return problem. The difficulty of coming back to a world that has not shared your experience. A world that has no language for what you saw. A world that will nod politely at your description and then ask you what it was like to be weightless. And it was not only Aldrin. A 2007 study published in the journal Aviation, Space, and Environmental Medicine surveyed 39 astronauts and found that a significant percentage reported lasting psychological disruption after returning to Earth. Not post-traumatic stress in the clinical diagnostic sense. Something more specific and harder to treat. A persistent, quiet difficulty re-engaging with the concerns of earthly life. A feeling of standing slightly outside the world they had returned to, looking at it from a distance they could not close. One astronaut described it as trying to care about traffic when you'd just seen the whole planet. And honestly, that is not an irrational response. What is irrational, if you think about it, is expecting a person who has held the entire world in their field of vision to come back and treat the lines on it as the most important thing in the room. But here is the question almost nobody asks. Why this view? Not space in general. Astronauts have described plenty of experiences in space that do not produce the overview effect. The technical work. The spacewalks. The experiments. The mechanical routines of keeping a spacecraft running. Those do not do it. It is specifically this. The view of Earth. Whole. From outside. Why does that particular image break the default mode network in a way nothing else does? Keltner's answer is about scale. The brain cannot categorize it. Newberg's answer is neurological. The image overwhelms the brain's self-referential processing. But there is a third answer. One that is harder to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, but keeps surfacing in what the astronauts actually say when they are being honest rather than precise. Maybe the brain responds this way because somewhere beneath all the modeling and predicting and categorizing and protecting, it already knows. It already knows that the lines are not real, that the borders are invented, that every category human beings use to separate themselves from each other is a construction. A story told by creatures who could never get far enough away to see the whole picture. And when the view from outside finally confirms it, when the eyes see what some part of the brain has always quietly understood, the system does not collapse. It exhales. Think about what that means for how we build nations and fight wars and draw fences across land that existed for 1 billion years before any fence was conceivable. Every single one of those structures is predicated on the idea that the divisions are real, that the separation is fundamental, that us and them is a feature of the world and not a feature of the story we tell about it. And one window, one view from 250 miles up, undoes all of it in 45 seconds. In 2020, researchers at the University of Missouri published a study in the journal Frontiers in Psychology examining whether a simulated overview effect experience could produce measurable psychological change in people who had never left Earth. They took participants and placed them inside immersive virtual reality headsets, showing real footage from the International Space Station. Not dramatized footage. Not CGI. Actual footage, shot by actual astronauts, of the actual Earth rotating below. Full field of vision immersion. As close to the real view as technology could currently get. The results were significant. Participants reported measurable decreases in feelings of national identity and in-group loyalty after the experience. Their responses to questions about global problems, climate, poverty, international cooperation, all shifted meaningfully toward collective thinking. Their scores on psychological measures of ego dissolution, the temporary softening of the sense of self as a separate entity, showed a real and statistically significant spike. The effect was smaller than what astronauts report. Obviously, a headset is not space. 20 minutes in a laboratory is not 178 days in orbit. But it was real, which means the effect is not about the physical location of being in space. It is about the visual information, the specific content of that image. Earth. Whole. Outside. Floating in darkness. No lines on it. Something about that image does something to the human brain that other images cannot replicate. Something it is almost as if the brain was waiting for. And in 2021, a group of researchers at the University of York in the UK published a follow-up study suggesting something even more provocative. They found that the psychological shifts from simulated overview effect experiences were most pronounced in participants who, before the experiment, scored highest on measures of stress, polarized thinking, and rigid group identity. In other words, the people who needed the view the most were the ones it worked on the hardest. Think about that for a second. Now, Carl Sagan gave a speech in 1994, not long before he died. It was about a photograph. A single photograph, taken by the Voyager 1 spacecraft on February 14, 1990, from a distance of 3.7 billion miles from Earth. Voyager was crossing the outer edge of the solar system. Sagan had requested years earlier that before the camera shut down forever, NASA turn it back toward home one last time. And in that photograph, Earth appears as a point of light so small it is barely visible. Smaller than a single pixel. A pale blue dot, caught in a stray beam of reflected sunlight against the absolute black of space. Sagan looked at that photograph and said, in his own words, "Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives." He described every king and peasant, every saint and sinner, every creator and destroyer, every act of heroism and cruelty in the history of human civilization. All of it, on that dot. Sagan was not describing the overview effect because he had never been to space. He was describing it from a photograph. A photograph of a dot so small it required an arrow in the caption to find it. And yet the structure of the experience is identical to what Edgar Mitchell felt from a window. What Ron Garan felt above the atmosphere. The same collapse of the false sense of scale. The same sudden clarity about what the human drama actually looks like from any meaningful distance. The overview effect, it turns out, is not about altitude. It is about perspective. And what the cumulative weight of this research is quietly suggesting, what it has been building toward for nearly 4 decades, is that the human brain is not only capable of this shift. It may be designed for it. Something in our neurology is primed for exactly this kind of expansion. This dissolving of the constructed self into the larger whole. This sudden recognition that the story of separation was never the full story. We just never had the view. For 300,000 years, Every human brain that ever developed was built inside the atmosphere. Inside the gravity well. Inside the model that said, the world is what you can see from where you are standing, and you are at the center of it. It took 60 people leaving the planet to discover what the view from outside does to the human brain. And those 60 people came back, one after another, trying to hand the rest of us something they couldn't wrap. Edgar Mitchell died in 2016. He was 85 years old. He had spent 45 years building a science around what happened to him in a window. He wrote papers. He gave lectures. He founded an institution. He spent the last 4 decades of his life doing the hardest thing a scientifically trained mind can do, trying to honestly investigate an experience that his training gave him no framework for. He never stopped believing it was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. Not the moon landing. Not the spacewalk. Not the lunar surface beneath his boots. The window. The ride home. The view of Earth from 240,000 miles away. He said near the end of his life, "We went to the moon as technicians. We returned as humanitarians." And what no one tells you about that statement, what gets lost every time it is quoted as an inspirational line on a poster, is that he did not say it as a triumph. He said it as a warning. Because here we are. Still inside. Still drawing the lines. Still treating the borders as if they were carved into the planet by something other than the agreements of frightened, territorial, small-scaled creatures who had never once seen the whole. 60-something people have had the model broken, have seen from outside that the divisions are stories and the separation is a construction, and the whole is realer than any of the parts. And they came back, every one of them, trying to explain it, trying to pass something through the inadequate sieve of language into the hands of the rest of us. And we listened. We nodded. We called it beautiful. We called it inspiring. And we went back to our maps. The Earth is still out there right now. Still wrapped in that thin blue line. Still one continuous, breathing, unbroken thing with no visible seams from far enough away. And somewhere above you, right now, a person is floating in a small metal room 250 miles up, looking out a window at a sunrise that happens every 45 minutes from orbit and feeling something in them give way that will never be rebuilt the same way. They will come back different. The question, the one the research keeps circling and never quite landing, is whether the rest of us need a rocket to get there. Or just a long enough look.